Right, well, welcome everybody, and as Father Ellis mentioned, Amy has taken ill. She's allowed me to tell you she was diagnosed with Lyme's disease the other day, and probably worse than the Lyme's disease for her right now is her reaction to the medication that she had. So she was nearly done, she forwarded it to me. The first thing I noticed is she did not have a title slide, so I called her and she said, "Oh, you can pick a nice title." Food security, that's what I did. Amy is a professor in my old department at the United States Military Academy. Actually, I hired her in 2005, and she is a physical geographer background. She got her PhD at Boston in energy and from a geographical perspective. But since she's been at West Point, she has done a great deal of work in Africa, in Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, and I know I'm missing one. Oh, Ethiopia, excuse me. And she's looking at matters of food security, urban development, and poverty, and as it relates to the environmental security model is where our research has intersected. And, I knew she would be excellent for this, and I'm sorry she can't be here, but she's done a great deal of work in the field with this. I think back to food security. I go all the way back to 1993. When I was in the Army as a major, I got deployed as part of the advanced party for our unit to go to Somalia. We went in for that short adventure, and our unit was going to go. I left the National Training Center at Fort Irwin with a couple of people. They put us in a Navy Viking, which is like a flying can, and they flew us to Somalia. And I was there for a week and a half, and at the end of that week and a half, then they said, "Well, your unit's not coming anymore," and I flew back happily. But the thing that got me about Somalia is being an American and not somebody who really paid much attention to food security. The underlying issue there was a drought, persistent drought for almost 30 years in the Horn of Africa, and which created a food insecurity issue, but it was also the problems of the militias in Mogadishu and Isle and other places who were preventing the distribution of food from the UN. But the thing that struck me was in the area, especially the coastal zone, the farm fields were rich. They were ready to be farmed, but the farmers could not. The militias wouldn't let them do that. And so that became one of my first experiences with the problem of undernourishment. And the people there were starving. It was a bit of a problem, and this brought me, and my association with the Army, to this matter of environmental security, where Amy and I intersect our work. And this is from Robert Kaplan, and it's a little bit of a doom and gloom prediction, but it is actually not too far off. The real problem in the sort of the global scope of food security and environmental change is the problem that our foreign policy is emerging by need and reaction rather than the result of any coherent or integrated plan. And this has been a problem since the first President Bush all the way through today. And the problem in Somalia that brought me into this was a reaction to that. And we see this again and again and again. And the IPCC now has become fully invested in this problem along with climate change, because now they're looking at the effects, and it began with their fourth assessment review about risks of conflict and instability, and obviously people living in poverty, people in failed and failing states where there may be plenty of food, but there are no distribution systems. So poor governance is a problem, social stratification, political fragmentation, problems of latent ethnic conflict, the pervasive effects of environmental change. And really, it brings us into three areas. It's exposure, adaptive capacity, and the vulnerability of the society. And those are the three areas that we look at with this environmental security model. So what does it say? And you can read that for yourself. There are a number of definitions for environmental security. This is the one actually that Amy and I published. Looking at a broad array of security issues triggered or exacerbated by demographic effects. Now, interestingly enough, in his last national security strategy, President Obama had a very compelling very short statement in his overview of how he perceived the world and what he was telling the security apparatus in America. He said something, and I paraphrase, that conflicts and diplomacy will no longer be very much about armies and departments of defense, but it will be increasingly be driven by factors such as demographics and climate change, and that's the concern. So we have looked at this. So how does this work, and how does food come into play here? So Amy and I have done a number of case studies looking at the Mayans, the Anasazi, going way back, all the way up to Syria today, looking at the environmental security model. And essentially it begins with a vulnerable society that's exposed to some change in the environment. It can be, I mean environment in the broadest sense. It could be the political environment, the natural environment, and that sends a shockwave through a society that has little ability to adapt. And the first manifestation of that is a reduced food supply. And you can follow the scenario through Syria, the Ogaden War of the 70s, same sorts of things seem to apply. So we have a reduced food supply, which then prompts the local indigenous folks to begin expanding their agriculture into what we'll call marginal lands, start farming on hill slopes, start draining marshes and places where they really shouldn't be farming in an attempt to generate more food. That, of course, then exacerbates the problem of land degradation. It puts sediment into the rivers. It causes a whole host of complementary problems when they begin to do that. The next thing that happens, and again, if you think of Syria, there's usually a mass migration, usually towards the cities, which further destabilize the society, and then eventually there's some form of instability or conflict. In Ogaden, in 1977, it meant that about 3.5 million Ethiopians migrated out of the highlands to the Ogaden, the river valleys down there, which they perceived as being better. The Somalis viewed this as their homeland territory that was taken from them by the British at the end of World War I. They saw this as a precursor to an invasion of a place that they had irredentist claims, and they attacked. So these are the sort of examples that we see. So the one thing we wanted to try to do was figure out a way that could we quantify the magnitude of the problem, and looking at matters of climate change, food security, water scarcity, could we identify states at risk to acute political instability or conflict related to these problems? And a group that I work with, we came up with the Vulnerability and Risk Index. And the basis behind this, and Amy's worked with me on this, was develop a quantitative index, simply identify states at risk, and we're looking at conflict triggered by environmental factors. We needed to identify key dimensions, and the critical thing we wanted to do was identify the minimum number of key variables. Now, we can all sit down and think about the variables that will cause, related to the environment and the adverse effects of climate change or the political system, that will drive instability. But what we were trying to do after a series of iterations of this, could we come down with perhaps 3, 4, or 5 variables that were absolutely critical to driving this model? And we started out with 16, and now we have it down to 6. In any event, we wanted to index the states from 0 to 4. 0 is the state most at risk. Actually, it's Sudan. Somalia is a close second. To the state least at risk, which in the latest version of the index is Finland, by way of example. So, of course, in order to do an index, you need to develop a model, and we looked to the IPCC, and we used their 3 metrics of exposure, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. And the model basically says that we start out in the middle with a vulnerable society. They are exposed to some climate shock, some adverse environmental effect, and that triggers instability. Now, adaptive capacity is the quality of the governance, GNI, gross national income, It could also be the intercession of religious groups, NGOs, the UN, or anybody else to help stabilize the society. Now, the outcome is not always a conflict. Some places adapt, and that's what we're trying to figure out here. Nonetheless, we worked with these three dimensions. We started out with 8 dimensions and 18 variables, and we eventually worked our way down to simplifying the model to these 3 dimensions and the variables that you see there, those 6, and how they play into the model, which is essentially pretty simple. Of course, from the IPCC, we looked at their exposure to climate change. From the World Bank, we used their governance data and the GNI. And in terms of the vulnerability of the society, we looked at 3 things. We looked at total fertility rate, food security, and the pre-existing vulnerability of the society to conflict. We put it in a very simple index, and we used the geometric mean of the 6 variables after we normalized them, because they're all different. TFR is a number. Food security is numbers of kilocalories per person per capita per day. So we had to get everything to a unitless number and get everything on the same scale. So we normalized everything, we ran it through, and this would be our vulnerability and risk index map. And it tracks well with what we expected. There are some interesting problems here. Of course, these seem to be the usual suspects in sub-Saharan Africa. The things that we were surprised at is how poorly Mexico came out. China, which some would not include China in an index like this one. There are several others done by some other people. Interestingly enough, the Ukraine, if you look at it. But the key here is you think of these very dark red areas when we look at some of the food maps that Amy's put together, and you can see how these things are linked. The problem here is, and you can see the numbers on there, but if we look at the 2 worst categories, most vulnerable to violent conflict and vulnerable to violent conflict and instability, that's 83 states, or 47% of the world's population. About 3.2 billion people are severely food insecure, and their societies are somewhat unstable. And the data that Amy explicitly worked on with us is, if we look at our index, and this is just simple correlation, this is not cause and effect, but just to show how they are related, food security is highly related to our index. Some other variables did not appear to be as highly related. So when we think about the matter of food security, I just want you to take a second and think about the foods that you consume during the course of the day as an American. What did you eat for breakfast? What did you have for lunch? How many snacks did you eat? What's your typical dinner look like? And I ask you to do this because the food we consume here is very different from the food that's consumed in other regions. Our protein sources are different. The types of grain we eat vary from place to place. But the factor is not just geography. There are important socioeconomic factors and environmental factors that play a role in this as well. This is my favorite picture. This is the average, according to the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Administration, this is the average American breakfast. I'm very motivated looking at it right now, but it is probably not the typical breakfast for many of us. But I'm sure, like me, you would enjoy eating it, and this is not the typical breakfast throughout much of the world. The key here is that, again, according to the FAO, the average caloric intake for a U.S. man should be about 2,500 calories a day, and for a woman, about 2,000 calories a day. Now, that's an average, and it's beset with all of the problems with very broad averages, but that's a good working total. Now, in 2016, Time Magazine did an interesting article here, and Amy elected to use this. They put together a series of pictures from around the world to highlight what the average family eats in various parts of the world and what their favorite foods are. And the other thing to pay attention to as we see this is the family size in association with the food. So this is the Rivas family from North Carolina, and I see all kinds of wonderful things in that picture that I'm excited by here as well. And their favorite foods are pizza, beef, pork, chicken, and of course, being good Americans, processed snacks, which is important. If we take a look at the Salas family in Mexico, their favorite foods are spaghetti, potatoes, chicken with sesame seeds. Many more breads, many more fruits, many more vegetables, almost no processed foods, and very little meat. And again, there's a slight uptick in the family size. We switch over to Europe, to the Melander family from Bergheide, Germany. Their favorite foods are fried potatoes with onions, bacon and herring, which is not having me excited right now, fried noodles, and pizza. And now I live with my elderly German mother-in-law, and she eats fried noodles every day. So this is not a lie. But again, notice the differences in the foods that we see in Europe. Again, more meat-related proteins, less processed foods, slightly more expensive eating than in the United States. Now, if we go to Tingo, Ecuador, the Ayami family, we notice the types of foods that they have. No processed foods. I don't see any meat in this picture, but they do have lots of fruits and vegetables, and they have 7 children. They're also feeding on $31 a week. This picture is taken in a refugee camp in Chad in 2004 after the fighting in Darfur. So these are Darfurian refugees in Chad. Their week's expenditure is $1.23. That's in our money. Their favorite food is a soup with fresh sheep meat, which they might eat maybe once a month. They get virtually no protein as we see it here. And that will bring us to Amy's points about malnutrition and other items as well. So, as we see this graph that's provided here, there are very, very clear regional differences in the food supply. This is a function of geography. We're talking about places with different climates, different soil types, different evapotranspiration and precipitation regimes. There's economics, there's culture behind some of the decisions what to eat and what not to eat, and there's stability as well. The chart shows daily per capita food supply in terms of kilocalories per person per day. Clearly, North America and Europe are at the top of the list, and again, clearly, Africa is at the bottom. It does show some of the gaps have closed worldwide, and worldwide the amount of kilocalories per day are increasing, which we heard this morning. And from 1950, and I'll take your comments about food, from 1950 until now, the global population doubled, and our total economic output had to rise by a factor of 4, which included much of our food production. We're expected to add another 3 billion from the time we had 6 to 9 in the next 50 years. Our total economic output will have to increase by a factor of 5. And it's different, again, because of the expectations in India, China, and other places where previously there was no middle class. So the interesting effects on this food chart are there for us to consider. The protein supply by region is, there's a more disparity and between haves and have-nots. There are clearly regional differences, and they are well defined here. This chart is showing daily protein supply by region as a function of grams of protein per person per day. The developed and developing regions typically differ most in their primary sources of protein consumed, as opposed to just calories consumed, as we saw in the previous chart. In the global north, the leading source of proteins are meat products, beef, pork, and poultry. Interestingly enough, North American protein intake has decreased in recent years, whereas in South America, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean it has slightly increased on average. So the next issue then is how does how does income influence diet? And diet, like agriculture, manifests a great deal of geographic diversity. Per capita income growth and urbanization have been shown to influence diets a great deal. Engel's law states that as income rises, the proportion of income spent on food declines. This allows households to spend an increasing percentage of their income on other goods and services. Households in poor regions spend a greater proportion of their income on food rather than household items that you see in wealthier regions. And this goes to the heart of the IPCC's concerns about adaptive capacity. In their research and some of the State Department research, the cutoff line is about per capita income of about $5,200 per year, based on current US dollars. Below $5,200 per year, Engel's law means that a household in Ghana or a household in the Congo lacks the income to provide the adaptive capacity to overcome problems associated with the adverse effects of environmental change or the local warlord who's not allowing them to get their food. And in fact, having served in many of these places, I will tell you that their day-to-day security is often a matter of their own personal initiative on top of that. So that creates a problem and relates directly to adaptive capacity. Bennett's law states that starchy staples dominate diet at low levels of income, and we see that here in the United States. But as income grows, the diet becomes more diversified to include fruits, vegetables, and animal products. Urbanization also influences diet. As areas become more urbanized, there's a greater demand for prepared foods, either from a restaurant or meals that are much, much easier to prepare at home. And that changes the way we view food as well. So, what is food security? So here is your definition from the UN FAO. The concern with this is, during the coming decades, climate change and population growth, rising food prices, and also lack of productivity, and environmental stressors will have a significant yet highly uncertain effect on food security as we go forward. So, what does this mean? The chart here is again from the FAO and it's from their latest publication, and it gives you a graphical depiction of the different stages of food insecurity. The other thing that is not quite as clear in this chart is that women are more likely than men to be affected by severe food security, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we'll go over the reasons for that towards the end of our talk. Two terms that get used interchangeably and usually incorrectly. Hunger, which is defined again by the UN, and malnutrition. Malnutrition is not necessarily hunger. Malnutrition, a malnourished person could be well fed, but they're eating the wrong foods in the wrong amounts. They're not getting the proper vitamins, the proper proteins. So there's two different problems at hand here. But essentially, 800 million to a billion people worldwide are suffering malnutrition today. It's about 1 in 9 people in the world who are not getting enough food in order to be healthy. This map is a little bit hard to digest and may not be as easy to read. What we're looking at here, the key metric here is the prevalence of undernourished people as a percentage of the population. In case you can't read it, the reds are 35 and over, 25 to 35, 15 to 25, yeah. And on down the line. And if you think of my environmental security map that I showed you, again, this band of problematic states throughout that area are the area of concern. So the question then is, in these states, who is hungry? And this is research from Sanchez. And new evidence continues to signal that hunger is on the rise worldwide. In 2017, the number of undernourished people was about 800 million to a billion, or about 1 out of every 9 people. Undernourishment and severe food insecurity appears to be increasing in all regions of Africa, as well as South America, whereas the undernourished situation is stable in most areas of Asia. In Africa, the situation is more pressing in this region of the sub-Saharan Africa, where it's estimated that about in aggregate, 23.2% of the population, or between 1 out of 4 people in the region, are suffering from chronic food deprivation. The increase in the prevalence of undernourishment has also been observed in sub-Saharan Africa, but the area of Eastern Africa is not as severely as affected. The thing that I find counterintuitive, and the thing that I cannot answer for you because I'm not an expert, is why are so many of the small farmers undernourished? I don't know. I didn't have time to look it up. I apologize. The other problem comes with the effects of undernourishment or malnutrition on children. And we're talking essentially about 3 forms of problems that we see: stunting, wasting, and obesity. Progress has been made worldwide through the effects of the UN on reducing child stunting. However, about 22% of the children in the world experience some form of stunted growth. That's down from 25% in 2012, due mainly to progress that they've had in Asia. Over 38 million children are said to be underweight in Africa today. So the problem with stunting is essentially irreversible. Child is born, child doesn't get the proper nourishment, bones don't grow, cognitive development doesn't happen, the brain doesn't develop properly, and it is often difficult to correct the effects of stunting. Wasting is a slightly different problem. People are just too thin for their body size. This is a little bit more corrective, ability to be corrected. And of course, the problem of obesity can come about from either too much food or too much of the wrong food. The main underlying causes for wasting are poor household food security, inadequate feeding and care practices, and poor access to health care, water, hygiene, and sanitation services. Suboptimal breastfeeding, poor complementary foods, and poor feeding practices can lead to rapid weight loss or failure of growth. The key about wasting, though, it is correctable. We think of food security transition, especially in the United States. We see a pre-transition, a transition, and a post-transition phase. Essentially, in the pre-transition, we're eating grains, tubers, vegetables, and fruits. The problem here is undernutrition and nutritional deficiencies. As food continues to overweight and obesity, as well as undernutrition, and high rates of these forms of malnutrition coexist in many countries. The higher cost of nutritious foods, the stress on living with food insecurity, and the psychological adaptations to food restrictions help explain why food insecure families may have a higher risk of overweightness and obesity, even despite the lack of food. So the USAID has put together a series of data sets to track obesity over a period of about 40 years. So we take a look in 1984. I think everybody can read the chart there. I'm colorblind, so I always have trouble with these. They'll look sort of gray to me. 1994. 2004. latest one in 2014 is their last update. Or percentages of obesity. And clearly the United States, Canada, as we've known, and parts of sort of the G8 countries, and interestingly enough, parts of South America have more of a problem. So that brings us to then the problem of climate change. In addition to conflict, climate variability and extremes are among the key drivers behind the recent uptick in global hunger and one of the leading causes of severe food crises. The cumulative effects of changes in climate, rapid changes in climate, or something we would call climate variability, is undermining all dimensions of food security, food availability, access, utilization, and stability. Climate variability and exposure to more complex, frequent, and intense climate extremes are threatening to erode and even reverse the gains made in ending hunger and malnutrition that we've made in the last 5 or 6 years. And a great example I can give you is here in our area, we average about 41 inches of rain per year. Last year, here in eastern Pennsylvania, we got 62 inches of rain per year. It caused havoc with all of our local farmers. In the United States, thankfully, we have the ability to overcome those problems. If we were a small state like Eritrea, we would not. Nor do we have the government's ability and the credible institutions that will help us overcome an extreme climate variability event like we experienced last year. Hunger is significantly worse and continues with agricultural systems that are highly sensitive to rainfall and temperature variability and severe drought, and where livelihood and high proportions of the population depend on agriculture. The interesting double-edged sword about climate change and variability is some regions are doing worse and some are actually doing better. They are receiving more rainfall and their temperatures have stabilized. If we take a look at using the A1F scenario here, this is the effects of global climate change on food production. And if we take a look here, you can see many areas of the world. Again, if you think of my environmental security map, this area here is somewhat troubled. The A1F scenario is a fairly moderate scenario. Interestingly enough, if we look at global rice production, many parts of the world are actually being able now to expand somewhat their production of rice, which is interesting and a staple crop in these areas here, but also adds more methane to the environment, which is exacerbating the problems of global climate change. Amy's work is in Africa, and she'll give you a short case study in Africa. And if we look, large segments of sub-Saharan Africa have severe to acute food insecurity, according to this map. More telling are the numbers of people who need emergency food, which is actually, I think, a little bit better map. Why it's not appearing, I don't know. I don't know why it's not appearing. It's my fault. In any event, in these countries, about 3 to 10 million people, on average, are in need of emergency food production. So, from the FAO 2018 Food Security Report, women are particularly vulnerable to climate variability and extremes, and their vulnerability derives from restricted access to the social and environmental resources required for adaptation. In many rural economies and resource-based livelihood systems, women have poorer access than men to the financial resources, land, education, health, and other basic rights that men experience. Further drivers of gender inequality include social exclusion from decision-making processes and labor markets, making women less able to cope and adapt with the effects of climate change and the resultant effects on food insecurity. In most countries, access to credit for female family members was found to be about 5 to 15% lower than their male equivalents. Moreover, social norms or time constraints may prevent women from seizing off-farm opportunities, which influence their level of vulnerability, their incomes, and ability to adjust to the agricultural production. In some communities, only men have the right to cultivate certain crops or to access markets. In addition, many adaptation practices require investments in cash, time, and labor, and are thus costly for households with limited access to credit. Furthermore, as women act as primary caregivers and providers of food, water, and fuel, they are more vulnerable when droughts and floods occur. For instance, with many dry seasons now becoming longer, women are working harder to feed and care for their families and provide water. In Central Africa, where Amy does her work, up to 90% of Lake Chad has disappeared, and women have to walk often a half a day to bring back the day's supply of water. One program which she has worked is the Greater Rural Opportunities for Women, or the GROW project. To accomplish this, and this is a Canadian program, spending about $20 million a year. They've engaged women farmers in soybean cultivation to increase agricultural production and strengthen market linkages and diversify the food basket at the household level, improve nutrition, and increase in the women's inclusion in household decision-making. Using a market-based approach, the project implementation focused on 3 areas: increase and diversity of agricultural production, increase in marketing, and improved nutrition. The GROW program has embraced diversification of activities and promoted the use of village savings and loan associations at the group level, and has nurtured and strengthened markets for women to sell their soy, whether individually or as an aggregate. The nutritional status for both men, women, and children have improved in areas where this program exists very significantly. About 88.7% of the women had a BMI that was in the normal range after being in the program for 1 year. And only 18.4% of the children were stunted, only 2.3% suffered from wasting, and only 11% from underweightness, respectively. This is a good example of a local program making changes. In the United States, there's an estimated about 11.8% of the U.S. households are food insecure in 2017, which is down from 2016 and shows a continuing decline from a high of 14.9% in 2011. This is still, however, above the pre-recession, i.e. 2007 rate of 11.1. The percentage of households with food insecurity in the severe range, or very low food security, has also declined in the United States during this time. Part of what makes food insecurity so difficult to solve are the underlying causes in the United States: poverty, unemployment or underemployment, and inconsistent access to enough healthy foods. These are often deeply interconnected. Moving in and out of food insecurity simply adds more stress to a household that may be already wrestling with instability and unpredictability. And of course, one of the major problems in the United States are access to good markets. And this is an interesting map: no car, no supermarket within 1 mile. Now, some places, I'm not that surprised by that. I mean, if you travel in this area, there's really nobody there. But surprisingly, in parts of America, we see areas of food deserts. So what can we do to solve these problems? And this is where some of Amy's work has been focused in Africa. This is a picture she took from Addis Ababa and shows a small urban farm. And this is one of the areas where she is working. Urban agriculture is another key component of the urban mosaic in which much of the global South participates in, and is an example of a functioning and critical part of an informal economy which can significantly reduce food insecurity. As cities grow, it is common to see agriculture in the peri-urban areas, or certainly around the outskirts of the city. However, small farms are scattered throughout the city, especially in slums, but however, they are vulnerable to pollution, especially from heavy metals. This is a picture from Accra in Ghana, taken by Amy. It's taken from the middle of an informal, dense urban area, and another example of an urban garden that's being used to feed a group of family, only led by women. There are no men in these families. Where would we be without Brooklyn? Small urban farms and rooftop gardens are also becoming popular in cities in the developing world. This is a picture taken from a Brooklyn garage roof in Brooklyn, New York. They farm 2 rooftops, and the food they produce is sold to members of the local CSA and has reduced the amount of obesity in this neighborhood. Another example of urban agriculture that's becoming more popular is a picture of a vertical farm taken in Newark, New Jersey, and they are exporting this technology to sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to end with a cow. Animal and fish proteins are an important part of our diet. These cows are raised for meat in Uganda and offer the only significant source of protein in the entire region, but they are also a source of income. In general, people need more protein than what they currently get in much of sub-Saharan Africa. Americans are getting 16% of their calories from protein, as are most important building block of our bodies. Excuse me. Grass-fed cattle can graze in areas that are not suitable for crops because of poor conditions, such as being too rocky. The problem is, in many parts of the world, the herders want to move their cattle into the areas where there are farmers. At the core of the problem in Darfur, for example, which then the government exploited and participated in a So with that, I hope I did Amy proud enough, and I have a few minutes for some questions, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you.